The Upper East Side townhouse stood as a monument to silent grief. Sunlight, pale and thin, filtered through the towering windows, failing to warm the cavernous rooms where every piece of furniture seemed draped in sorrow. The air was thick and still, heavy with the unspoken name of Daniel, the youngest son, whose absence had hollowed out the very soul of the home. It was a place of oppressive luxury, where the gleam of polished marble and the weight of silk curtains only magnified the profound emotional void. Wealth was a cold comfort, a gilded cage that trapped the family in their shared yet separate mourning. In the oppressive quiet of the grand living room, the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece sounded unnaturally loud, each second marking another moment of a life that would never be lived. At the head of a long mahogany table sat Eleanor Sinclair, a woman of 65 whose posture was as impeccable as her grief was raw. Dressed in a tailored Chanel suit, her only adornment a simple string of pearls, she was the picture of control. As the former chairwoman of the family's corporation, she was accustomed to command, to shaping the world around her with a quiet, unyielding will. But the weariness in her eyes betrayed the facade. The loss of her son had eroded her foundations, leaving her adrift in a sea of meaningless opulence. She projected strength, a matriarch upholding her family's dignity, but inwardly she was crumbling. This meeting, this cold dissection of Daniel's estate, was just another performance, another way to maintain order in the face of utter chaos. The family lawyer, a man who had served the Sinclairs for decades, cleared his throat, his discomfort palpable in the tense silence. He spoke of a final piece of correspondence related to Daniel's affairs, his gaze fixed on a point just above Eleanor's head. He presented a simple, handwritten letter. It was from a woman named Sarah, informing them of the existence of her son, Lucas, who was also Daniel's son. It was not a demand for money, he stressed, but a gesture of respect. The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. Eleanor's husband slammed his hand on the table, his face contorted in rage, while her other son sneered, calling the woman a gold digger. They demanded a paternity test, not to find the truth, but to expose a perceived fraud and protect their inheritance. For Eleanor, the words were a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. A grandson, a living, breathing piece of her lost boy. The news shattered the armor she had so carefully constructed around her heart, and for a moment the world tilted on its axis. While her husband and son plotted their legal attack, their voices a venomous buzz in her ears, Eleanor saw only the image of a small child with Daniel's eyes. The family's immediate, cruel dismissal of this boy and his mother was a fresh wound atop an old one, an injustice that resonated deep within her soul. It's truly heartbreaking how quickly judgment can overshadow compassion. If you believe these stories of quiet strength deserve to be heard, subscribing is the most powerful way to help us continue sharing them. The decision to act came not as a thought, but as a deep, undeniable pull from within. In the days following the disastrous family meeting, Eleanor Sinclair moved through her opulent home like a ghost, the angry words of her husband and son echoing in the cavernous rooms. They spoke of lawyers and strategies, of protecting the family name from a vulgar opportunist. But Eleanor heard none of it. Her mind was consumed by a single, shattering image, a small boy with Daniel's eyes. This was not a matter for attorneys, it was a matter of the soul. Driven by a force she hadn't felt since Daniel himself was a child, she bypassed her family's network of fixers and investigators. She found Sarah's address on her own, a simple act of autonomy that felt like the first real choice she had made in years. Her memory drifted back to a winter night 2 decades ago, when Daniel was 6. He had a fever that wouldn't break, his small body trembling under the weight of his illness. Eleanor had sat by his bed for 3 days straight, refusing to leave his side. bathing his forehead with a cool cloth and whispering stories until her voice was hoarse. She remembered the fierce primal terror and the overwhelming love that had coursed through her, a love so powerful it felt like it could physically shield him from harm. That feeling, so raw and potent, had been buried under layers of grief and duty since his death. Now, the thought of another child, his child, being vulnerable and alone in the world, reawakened that dormant protector within her, a force far stronger than any corporate directive or social expectation. The drive to Queens was a journey across a chasm. Her chauffeured car, a silent, air-conditioned capsule of privilege, glided through the streets of Manhattan and over the bridge into a different reality. The gleaming glass towers of her world gave way to brick apartment buildings, their fire escapes a delicate lacework against the aging facades. The muted quiet of the Upper East Side was replaced by a symphony of city life. The rumble of an elevated train, the chatter of different languages, the smell of street food mingling in the air. For Eleanor, it was like seeing the city for the first time, not as a map of assets and appointments, but as a sprawling, breathing organism teeming with lives she had never considered. Each block took her further from the woman she was supposed to be and closer to the woman she needed to become. She found the address, a modest pre-war building with a worn marble lobby and a lingering scent of bleach. Standing before Sarah's apartment door, number 4B, Eleanor's hand hesitated for a long moment. Everything in her life, every lesson in decorum and self-preservation screamed at her to turn back. This was a breach of protocol, an emotional impulse that defied the cold logic that had governed her existence. She was Eleanor Sinclair, a name that commanded respect in boardrooms and at charity galas. Here, she was just a woman, a grieving mother, standing on the precipice of a truth that could either destroy what was left of her family or just maybe offer some form of redemption. With a deep breath that did little to calm the tremor in her soul, she finally raised her hand and knocked. The woman who opened the door was younger than Eleanor had pictured, with a weariness etched so deeply around her eyes that it seemed a permanent part of her features. Yet those same eyes held a defiant strength, the unmistakable look of a mother who would stand between her child and the world. This was Sarah. The small apartment behind her was immaculate but sparse, every object in it chosen for function over form. A child's colourful drawings were taped to the refrigerator, a vibrant splash of innocence against the backdrop of their humble circumstances. In that single, sweeping glance, Eleanor saw no evidence of a calculated grifter. She saw a young woman shouldering an immense burden with a quiet, exhausted dignity, and the carefully constructed narrative of greed her family had created began to crumble into dust. Eleanor began to speak, the rehearsed formal words feeling hollow and absurd on her tongue, but Sarah cut her off, her voice strained. Lucas wasn't there. He had been admitted to the hospital the night before. His cold had worsened, settling deep in his chest, and the doctor had used a single, terrifying word: pneumonia. The air in the small hallway grew thick, charged with a shared, unspoken fear that transcended the gulf of status and circumstance between them. All of Eleanor's carefully prepared questions, her cautious suspicions, evaporated in an instant. The purpose of her visit had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer there to interrogate or to assess. A child was sick. Her grandson was sick. Nothing else in the world mattered. The city hospital in Queens was a stark contrast to the hushed private medical facilities the Sinclair family used. It was a chaotic ecosystem of human suffering and resilience, filled with the urgent beeping of machines, the rushed footsteps of nurses, and the low murmur of anxious families in the waiting rooms. The air smelled of antiseptic and worry. Here, the name Sinclair meant nothing. Eleanor was stripped of her armor of wealth and influence, becoming just another anonymous face in a crowd of people praying for good news. She followed Sarah through the bustling corridors, her expensive leather shoes feeling utterly out of place on the scuffed linoleum floors. For the first time in a long time, she felt completely powerless, a raw vulnerability that was both terrifying and strangely clarifying. They reached the pediatric ward and stopped outside a room. Through the glass, Eleanor saw him, a tiny figure lost in a large hospital bed, a clear oxygen mask obscuring his small face, his chest hitched with each labored breath, a fragile rhythm that seemed to fill the entire room. Sarah pushed the door open, and Eleanor stepped inside, her heart constricting in her chest. As she drew closer, the boy's eyes fluttered open, and in that moment, the world stopped. They were Daniel's eyes, the same deep, soulful brown, the same gentle curiosity, the same old-soul wisdom she had seen in her own son's gaze from the day he was born. The resemblance was so profound, so absolute. It was like looking at a ghost, a memory made real. Every doubt, every defense she had erected was obliterated by that one look. Eleanor found herself moving toward the bed, her hand reaching out on its own accord to touch his small, warm fingers. The connection was instantaneous, a jolt of pure, unconditional love that traveled up her arm and settled directly in her heart. In that single, silent touch, the venomous accusations of her family, the cold calculations of her husband, the weight of public opinion, it all dissolved into nothing. This was not an inheritance issue. This was not a scandal. This was her grandson. This was a piece of Daniel, alive and breathing, and in need of her. It's in these quiet, defining moments that we see a person's true character emerge. If you find yourself moved by these journeys of the heart, please consider subscribing. It allows us to bring more of these important stories to light. Later, as Lucas drifted into a fitful sleep, Sarah spoke. She sat in the worn visitor's chair, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, and told Eleanor about her life with Daniel. Her voice was soft, devoid of accusation or demand. She spoke of their meeting at a small art gallery, of his gentle humor, of their shared dream of a simple life away from the crushing weight of his family's expectations. She showed Eleanor a picture on her phone. Daniel, smiling, holding a visibly pregnant Sarah, his hand resting protectively on her stomach. He had been happy, genuinely happy, in a way Eleanor realized she had never seen. He had known about his son, and he had been overjoyed, planning a future that had been stolen from them all. While Sarah spoke of a love that was pure and hopeful, Eleanor's phone buzzed relentlessly in her purse. A barrage of text messages from her husband Robert and her other son Thomas. Their words were cold and sharp, a stark counterpoint to the quiet grief in the hospital room. They demanded to know what she was doing, accusing her of being manipulated, of compromising the family. They talked of court orders and legal injunctions, of forcing a paternity test to expose the fraud. Their messages were a transmission from another universe. A world governed by power and control, completely detached from the fragile human reality unfolding right in front of her. The chasm between her family's world and her newfound purpose had become a canyon. Eleanor silenced her phone, the buzzing finally stopping, leaving a profound quiet in its wake. She looked at the sleeping child, his small chest rising and falling in a more stable rhythm now, his hand still loosely curled around her finger. A fierce, unyielding resolve solidified within her. It was not a decision born of logic or strategy, but a vow forged in the crucible of love and loss. She would not let this boy and his mother be crushed by the Sinclair machine. She would not allow Daniel's true legacy, this child, this love, to be erased by their greed and fear. In the sterile quiet of that hospital room, surrounded by the hum of medical equipment, Eleanor Sinclair, matriarch and CEO, went to war, not for an empire of wealth, but for the future of one small boy. The silence in Daniel's room had become a physical presence, a shrine Eleanor had refused to disturb for months. Now she entered it not as a mourner, but as an archaeologist of her son's soul. The space was preserved just as he had left it, the air still holding the faint, familiar scent of sandalwood and old books. She began to sort through his belongings, her movements slow and deliberate. It was a final, painful ritual. She folded the sweaters he'd loved, ran her fingers over the spines of his favorite novels, and packed away the remnants of a life that felt both impossibly distant and achingly close. She wasn't just cleaning a room. She was searching for a truth she felt she had missed, a final message from the boy she had raised, but perhaps never fully known, a clue hidden somewhere within the quiet artifacts of his existence. At the back of his closet, behind a row of shoes he never wore, she found it. A simple, unadorned wooden box. It wasn't locked, and as she lifted the lid, her heart hammered against her ribs. Inside, there were no hidden valuables, no secret accounts, only a stack of letters bound with a simple piece of twine and a handful of photographs. The first one she picked up made the world tilt on its axis. It was a picture of Daniel, his arm wrapped tightly around a pregnant Sarah. He was looking down at her belly, his face alight with a kind of pure, unburdened joy Eleanor hadn't seen in years. It was the look of a man who had found his purpose. In that single, candid moment, the entire narrative of greed and deceit constructed by her family was instantly and irrevocably shattered. She sat on the edge of his bed, the afternoon light fading around her, and read his letters one by one. The words on the page were a revelation, painting a portrait of a man deeply in love and ecstatic about becoming a father. He wrote to Sarah about his plans for their future, a simple life far from the suffocating expectations of the Sinclair name. He spoke of Lucas with a father's pride, dreaming of the day he would hold him. With every sentence, Eleanor felt a profound, gut-wrenching sorrow for the happiness that had been stolen from him, but it was quickly eclipsed by a cold, clarifying anger. Daniel hadn't been trapped by an affair. He had been liberated by love. Her family wasn't protecting his legacy. They were actively trying to erase the only part of it that had ever truly mattered to him. The next morning, she summoned her husband and son to the library. They arrived with their lawyer, their expressions a mixture of impatience and condescending pity, assuming she had finally succumbed to their pressure. They saw the grieving, fragile woman they had been manipulating for months. But the Eleanor who stood before them was someone else entirely. Her posture was erect, her gaze as sharp and unyielding as polished steel. She carried a small leather portfolio, which she placed on the table between them with a quiet finality. The room, usually a stage for their corporate power plays, became a courtroom, and they were about to find themselves on the losing side of a trial they didn't even know had begun. The balance of power in the Sinclair family had just irrevocably shifted. "There will be no test," Eleanor stated, her voice calm, but carrying an authority that silenced the room. She slid the photograph of Daniel and Sarah across the table, letting the image speak for itself. Then she opened the portfolio and began to read from Daniel's letters, his own words of love and devotion filling the cold, sterile space. "Daniel's inheritance was never about money," she said, her eyes locking onto her husband's. "It was about the life he was so excited to build. It's in his son." She picked up the legal document demanding the paternity test, the symbol of their cynical war. Slowly, deliberately, she tore it in half and let the pieces fall to the table. "I will be establishing a trust for Lucas with my own fortune. It is the only part of this family's wealth that will ever honor my son's true memory." Seeing a heart choose love over legacy is a powerful reminder of what truly matters. If these stories of quiet courage resonate with you, your subscription allows us to continue bringing them to light. The aftermath was not a storm, but a quiet, seismic shift. The Upper East Side townhouse, once a mausoleum of grief, slowly began to breathe again. Eleanor welcomed Sarah and Lucas not as beneficiaries, but as family. The oppressive silence was replaced by the sound of a small boy's laughter echoing down the marble hallways, a sound more precious than any stock dividend. Toys appeared in the grand living room, bright plastic soldiers staging a silent coup against the somber, antique decor. Eleanor found herself on the floor, helping Lucas build a tower of blocks, her Chanel suit forgotten. She wasn't just providing a home, she was building one, piece by piece, discovering a purpose that had been buried under decades of corporate strategy and social obligation. The house was no longer a monument to what was lost, but a sanctuary for what had been found. The change did not happen overnight, but love, once allowed in, has a way of eroding even the most fortified walls. Robert and Thomas, initially cold and distant, could not indefinitely resist the simple, unassuming joy that Lucas brought into their lives. It began in small moments, Robert pausing to watch Lucas chase a butterfly in the garden, a flicker of Daniel's childhood ghosting across his stern features. Then Thomas, finding himself drawn into a surprisingly competitive video game with his young nephew, the sneer on his face replaced by a genuine smile. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic scenes of reconciliation. Instead, there was a slow, unspoken acceptance, a gradual thawing of frozen hearts as they began to see not an heir or a problem, but simply a boy who was, undeniably, a part of them. 5 years later, the transformation was complete. The Daniel Foundation had become one of the city's most respected charities, a powerful legacy born from a mother's pain. Using her formidable business acumen and personal fortune, Eleanor had created an organization that provided housing, education, and legal support for single mothers facing impossible odds, turning her private grief into a public good. The townhouse was filled with warmth and light, its rooms often hosting charity events where Sarah, now a confident director at the foundation, spoke with quiet authority. Eleanor, watching a 9-year-old Lucas run through the garden with his friends, felt a profound peace. She had not just saved her grandson, she had saved herself, finding a wealth far greater than any balance sheet could measure. The family was no longer defined by its name or its net worth, but by the bonds they had chosen to forge. They were a mosaic, pieced together from broken parts to create something stronger and more beautiful. Eleanor had learned that a true inheritance isn't something you leave behind in a will. It's the love you build in the hearts of others, a legacy that compounds with every act of compassion. Her victory was not loud or celebrated in the society pages, but it was absolute. It was the quiet, enduring triumph of a heart that refused to close. Stories like this are a testament to the quiet strength that can change the world, and your subscription helps ensure these powerful reminders of hope continue to be shared.